It's day 9. I'm about 950, something like that, miles into the journey now. I've got about 12 to 13 knots of wind, again from behind. I'm on a port tack and doing around about 4 or 5 knots. There's light winds forecast over the next few days, mostly coming on Saturday, and I decided I can either sit around and be becalmed, or I can work on fixing this symmetric spinnaker that I have and hopefully, get moving. It's a bit of a tall task to try and sew it. There are 2 good sort of 1.5 meter tears in it, but if I can salvage something from it, it'll be worthwhile and it'll keep me moving when the lighter winds come. I've got 2 days yet to prepare, so hopefully it all goes well. Aha, she flies. It looks like some of the work repairing the spinnaker paid off. Like, I didn't really sew all the damage. Some of it was just far too long. It would have taken weeks to fix, and I probably didn't have enough thread anyway. So I used some tape, just stuck some tape on either side of the tears, and so far that seems to be holding in these light winds. I'm using some tape that's actually designed for glazing or repairing windows. And currently there's about 6.5 to 7 knots of wind, and I'm making between 3.5 to 4.5 knots boat speeds. You might notice I've only got 2 control lines at the moment. This is just because I was wanting to test it quite quickly. When I'm flying it normally, I'll have 4 lines, and that just enables me to position it correctly and get it flying in the cleanest air. So far so good. And hopefully it holds up. I'm looking forward to making progress in these lighter conditions. It's lunchtime on day 11. I suppose really this should be the halfway point in a 21-day crossing. I'm currently about 1,500 nautical miles away from Martinique, and so not quite at halfway. Halfway would have been around 1,350, something like that. But the winds have been quite fickle, and now there's just nothing. I'm having to motor. I decided to just leave it last night. I was becalmed, got a good night's rest, and this morning there was still no wind. I did have a quick look at the spinnaker, but the spinnaker itself needs about 6 to 7 knots of wind before it will even fly properly, and at the moment there's a lot less than 6 knots, so I'm having to motor. I put another 30 litres of diesel in the tank, and that should get me through a good part of today, and I'll see what happens in the afternoon. In the meantime, after the failure of the banana cake, I decided to give a chocolate cake a go. This is a tried and tested recipe, although I might have added a little bit more rum and a few other ingredients, but hopefully that works out well, and I'll be munching on a bit of chocolate cake for the next couple of days. It's day 13 and I've now officially reached the halfway point in terms of distance. There's now 1,350 nautical miles to go. Unfortunately, it's taken me 12 and a half days to make that. So that means I'm looking at what, a 24-day crossing possibly, or 25-day crossing. But hopefully now, as I keep heading further and further south, the weather will improve a little bit. Although as I say that, it's very, very overcast at the moment. It's just started raining. There's no sun to be had anywhere and there's no wind. So it kind of sums up this trip. But hopefully the second half there's going to be much more exuberant sailing. I've just had lunch and the Yanmar's still humming away there in the background. There's about 10 knots of wind from behind now, so it might be possible to fly the Spinnaker, but just as I say that, the rain started coming down harder and it just doesn't look like much fun out there. So I might hide in here for a little while, just until this rain passes, and then give it a go. With 10 knots, it should be okay. I was flying it yesterday evening, but I took it down just before dark. And then I was sailing with a pulled out Genoa on a starboard tack. Unfortunately, either the wind shifted or I went through the wind and then had to jibe, which it isn't really a jibe. It involves completely furling in the sail, taking down the pole, carrying it around the staysail and putting it back up. All in all about 30 or 40 minutes, which is just what you want at 3 AM in the morning. But that was running until this morning, where I tried the Spinnaker again, but there's about a 3 to 3.2 meter swell and the thing was just swaying from side to side, collapsing and then filling again, and I was just getting nowhere, hence the engine. But yeah, hopefully in a little while when this rain stops I can get sailing again and making some progress without this incessant noise. Finally, I'm able to fly the Spinnaker. Last time I went to fly it, the wind dropped from about 10 knots behind me to something like 1.5 knots, then to 0.6 knots. So I've been forced to motor for another sort of 4 or 5 hours. But finally, now I have a little bit of wind. It's quite late in the evening now and I'm all set up for my night watch. I generally like to do it here from the cockpit where possible, but also I can do it from my main cabin that has good views around the boat. I have my AIS alarm set for proximity and also 2 radar guard zones, and generally I'm just looking out for other vessels. It's a dark night, so it's practically impossible to see anything around the boat. I can see maybe a meter or two either side, but from the cockpit here, the bow is maybe 8.5 meters away, and so it's practically impossible to see anything. I do look out for lights of other vessels. I haven't really come across any here in the middle of the Atlantic, but you never know. And every so often I do get up and have a wander around the boat and check for chafing or anything sort of out of the ordinary. I had a little bit of fun earlier on with the spinnaker. I was flying along at about 7.5 to 8.5 knots. The wind had really picked up a little bit, which was fantastic. Unfortunately, it happened to coincide with sunset, and I felt it only prudent to take the spinnaker down once it got dark, and thankfully I did. After setting the Genoa up, a squall came through of about 25 knots, and if I still had the spinnaker up, it would have caused me a bit of bother, so I'm glad that I took that down. Now I'm doing about 4.5 to 5.5 knots. It's relatively comfortable. There's still a 3-meter swell on the beam, but things seem to be calming down a little bit, and hopefully I'm in for a peaceful and uneventful night. I'm now on to the 4th sail plan so far that I've used on the journey, and it's propelling me along at about 5.5 to 6.5 knots. There's been squall after squall after squall throughout the night and throughout this morning, but you know, when you spent most of the trip complaining about the lack of wind, you can't then start complaining when there's a little bit too much. So I'm happy enough. I'm making good progress. The wind has been shifting a little bit from port to starboard, starboard to port again. So I am going to have to make some adjustments, but everything's going well. There's still a fair bit of swell. The wind itself is anywhere between 13 and 20 knots, just somewhere off the stern. And yeah, that's about it really. I thought I slept really well last night despite all the squalls, but I've been super tired today. I have been napping when I can, but now it's lunchtime, so I'm about to eat some of that delicious chili that I made last night.